Imagine being born into a golden cage where your intelligence is your greatest curse. Where every book you read, every language you master, every question you dare to ask only tightens the invisible chains around your future. You're 15, standing before Venetian mirrors in a sealed pavilion, watching your own reflection as strange women prepare your body for a night you don't yet understand. Your mother kissed your forehead this morning without meeting your eyes. Now you know why. Because what awaits you tonight isn't love, or even marriage in any recognizable form. It's a ceremony of erasure so calculated, so psychologically devastating, that centuries later, historians would struggle to speak its name aloud. Before we descend into what really happened behind those palace doors, I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching this from? It amazes me that a story buried for centuries in Ottoman archives now reaches someone, somewhere, who needed to hear it. The year was 1606, and inside Topkapi Palace, the heart of an empire that stretched across 3 continents, a daughter was born to Sultan Ahmed I and Kaksem Sultan, a woman who would later rule the Ottoman world from behind veils of protocol. They named her Fatma. The chroniclers recorded her birth with the usual pomp cannons fired across the Bosphorus, gold coins scattered in the streets, prayers offered in every mosque from Belgrade to Baghdad. What they didn't record, what they couldn't have known, was that this child's exceptional mind would become the very instrument of her destruction. Fatma Sultan grew up in chambers lined with Persian manuscripts and astronomical charts. Palace tutors whispered about her brilliance by age 10. She debated Islamic law with scholars twice her age. She spoke Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Ottoman Turkish with equal fluency. She studied the movement of celestial bodies and could recite poetry that made hardened generals weep. European envoys who glimpsed her during diplomatic ceremonies reported back to their courts with a mixture of admiration and unease. The Ottoman princess possessed an intellect that would have been celebrated in any prince, but in a daughter, it was merely convenient. Because from the moment of her birth, Fatma's life had already been written in invisible ink on documents she would never be allowed to read. The Ottoman Empire had perfected something other dynasties only attempted, a system so methodically cruel that it transformed royal daughters from potential threats into perfect instruments of state policy. Marriage, in this context, was not about love or even alliance in the traditional sense. It was about control, about creating human guarantees, living seals on treaties written in flesh rather than wax. When Fatma turned 14, the decision was made. Not by her, not for her benefit. The man selected was Kara Mustafa Pasha, a military commander scarred by campaigns against Persia. A man nearly twice her age who had never spoken a word to her. The match served multiple purposes, rewarded his battlefield loyalty, neutralized potential rivals by binding them to the imperial family, and demonstrated to the empire's elite exactly what obedience looked like. Fatma learned of her fate the way prisoners learn of their execution date, through whispers, averted eyes, and the sudden gentleness of people who know what's coming. What followed was called Turbi-i-Mubarak, the sacred education. The term itself was a masterpiece of linguistic deception, wrapping brutality in the silk of tradition. 3 months before the wedding, Fatma was removed from her chambers and placed under the supervision of Gulnar Hatton, a 60-year-old administrator who had overseen this process for more than a dozen princesses. Gulnar's face, according to one rare memoir, bore the expression of a woman who had long ago made peace with being the instrument of suffering. She was not cruel by nature. She was simply efficient. The training began at dawn. Inside a room, the palace called the Deodasi, the bride's chamber, every surface had been chosen for psychological effect. Dark ebony panels absorbed light. Persian carpets muffled sound. The air itself seemed to press down with expectation. Here Fatma learned that even walking was no longer instinctive. The Uriwai Selam, the walk of greeting, required steps measured to the finger's width, head inclined at precisely 30 degrees, hands never rising above the heart. She practiced this for hours until her legs trembled and her vision blurred. But movement was only the foundation. Speech became the true battleground. Fatma's vocabulary, that glorious, expansive vocabulary that had once allowed her to debate philosophers, was systematically reduced to 43 approved words, expressions of gratitude, apologies, acknowledgments of authority, nothing else. Any deviation, any attempt to ask a question or express an opinion resulted in immediate punishment. Sometimes it was fasting until weakness made resistance impossible. Sometimes it was isolation in windowless rooms where the only sound was her own breathing. And sometimes, most devastatingly, it was public humiliation before the entire female court where her failures were displayed like broken pottery. Archives recovered from the palace vaults describe what came next with clinical precision, which somehow makes it worse. In underground chambers few knew existed, exact replicas of bridal rooms had been constructed. Inside them stood anatomical figures crafted by Venetian artisans' wax mannequins designed with disturbing accuracy. Before stern instructors who recorded every reaction, Fatma was forced to rehearse acts no 15-year-old should comprehend. The sessions were called Talim-i-Sir, the teaching of secrets, though there was nothing sacred about them. Every hesitation extended the training. Every tear added another session. Fear itself became something to be conditioned out of existence, replaced by a hollow compliance that physicians of the time called the ecstasy of submission. Twice each week, Fatma was required to serve her own father's concubines, women who shared the sultan's bed but who stood in the palace hierarchy above a princess awaiting marriage. She washed them, combed their hair, fed them by hand while they laughed and gossiped. Witnesses later recalled that Fatma's hands shook so violently during these rituals that water spilled across marble floors. The point was not hygiene or service. Its point was the complete dismantling of pride, the systematic destruction of any remaining sense of self-worth. 1 week before the wedding, Fatma was moved to the Galen KK, the bride's pavilion, a structure sealed from all outside sound. Here, control became total. Her meals were regulated pomegranates for fertility, honey for sweetness, almonds and goat's milk infused with Yemeni spices. Her baths lasted hours, supervised by women who applied oils mixed with valerian, poppy extract, and orange blossom. Alchemists trained in Cordoba prepared these elixirs to induce what they called spiritual softening, though we would recognize it as mild sedation. The walls were draped with tapestries depicting ideal wives receiving heavenly rewards for their obedience. Mirrors forced Fatma to observe herself constantly, as if her own reflection had become another form of surveillance. During this final week, she was introduced to Muraqabiyya, term borrowed from Sufi mysticism, where it meant contemplative awareness of the divine. Inside the palace, it meant something else entirely. The practice of monitoring your own thoughts for signs of rebellion, of becoming your own jailer. Fatma was taught to recognize and suppress any mental resistance, any flicker of longing for a different life. Even her interior world was no longer safe. By the time March 15, 1623 arrived, the transformation was complete. Istanbul erupted in celebration streets filled with musicians. Acrobats tumbled before cheering crowds, and inside Topkapi Palace, banquets stretched across halls where European ambassadors marveled at the empire's wealth. Janissaries competed in displays of strength. Persian dancers moved like living flames. To anyone watching, it looked like joy incarnate. Court physicians, however, recorded something different. They noted that Princess Fatma, despite the cool March air, was drenched in cold sweat. Her lips were cracked and colorless. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her eyes, once so bright with curiosity, now stared at nothing in particular, as if she were watching something happening in a different room, a different lifetime. When the public celebrations ended and civilian guests departed, Fatma was escorted toward the nuptial pavilion deep within the palace gardens. The structure was octagonal, built according to architectural plans dating back to Mehmed the Conqueror, 3 ascending levels, each designed for a specific purpose. Nothing about this building was accidental. Every corridor, every threshold had been engineered to reinforce what was about to happen. The first level, Taharet Kadi, the chamber of purification, subjected Fatma to ritual baths that lasted for hours. Carrara marble reflected torchlight across water infused with Damascus rose, musk oil, and Somali ambergris. The scents were overwhelming, designed to disorient. Physicians applied ointments containing diluted opium and mandrake substances, meant to calm resistance and create what they clinically described as receptivity. On the second level, Teslim Kadi, the floor of surrender, Fatma was dressed in her wedding gown. To observers, it appeared magnificent white silk woven with gold thread, adorned with pearls from the Persian Gulf. But the garment was engineered for control. Hidden internal fastenings restricted movement. The crown's weight forced her head into a submissive angle. Anklets subtly limited her stride. Even beauty in this context was a form of imprisonment. While Fatma underwent this transformation, Kara Mustafa Pasha received very different preparation. Surrounded by advisors and veteran commanders, he was instructed not in tenderness or partnership, but in domination. He learned techniques of intimidation, calculated phrases meant to establish immediate authority, methods to ensure that any remnant of the princess's spirit would be thoroughly extinguished. There would be no ambiguity in this union, no possibility of resistance. Then came the ascent to the third level, Zifaf Kadi, the chamber of consummation. Its walls were covered with tapestries depicting conquered cities and defeated armies. Visual reminders that what was about to occur followed the same logic as military victory. The furniture had been specifically designed, beds with concealed restraining systems, cushions soaked in numbing oils, lighting calculated to confuse and exhaust. This was not a bedroom. It was a theater of submission. When the doors finally closed, leaving Fatma alone with her husband, medical records describe what followed as Rai Tamdi Messi complete collapse of the spirit. Months of conditioning had depleted her capacity to respond in any recognizable human way. Her body shook uncontrollably. Her voice, when it emerged at all, was barely audible. Her eyes fixed on distant points as if she were no longer present in her own flesh. Kara Mustafa, trained in siege warfare and battlefield command, initially interpreted this as defiance requiring correction. He applied the methods he'd been taught: calculated displays of force, intimidation, the systematic breaking of will. But there was no will left to break. Fatma had already retreated to the only place of safety remaining: complete dissociation. Her mind had abandoned her body as a final act of self-preservation. Palace observers, hidden behind screens as protocol required, recorded the night as difficult for all parties. Coded documents written in Persian speak of internal injuries, repeated loss of consciousness, and what physicians call the departure of the soul from the body while breath remains. When consummation was finally achieved after hours of failed attempts, it was less a wedding night than a medical crisis witnessed and documented by strangers. In the days that followed, even the strictest instructors in the harem expressed alarm. Fatma developed selective mutism, speaking only when directly commanded, and then only in whispers. Her appetite vanished entirely, forcing attendants to feed her like a child. The brilliant girl who once challenged scholars and mapped the movements of stars had been replaced by something hollow and obedient to body, without an inhabitant. Worse still, she developed what court records called the disease of fear. The presence of any man, even trusted eunuchs who had served her since childhood, triggered immediate panic, rapid breathing, cold sweats, sudden fainting spells. Palace physicians diagnosed Bacchiar melancholy, virginal melancholy, condition they described with disturbing casualness as common among imperial princesses following their first marital night. They spoke of it the way one might discuss a mild fever, as if irreversible psychological trauma were simply an expected side effect of marriage. They tried everything their medical knowledge allowed. Herbal remedies prepared according to ancient Greek texts, Music therapy using instruments tuned to frequencies believed to restore spiritual balance. Sufi exercises meant to reconnect the soul to the body. Nothing worked. Nothing could return the person Fatma had been. Her marriage to Kara Mustafa continued in form, but not in substance. There were children, 3 sons and a daughter, conceived during encounters the palace referred to as fulfillment of dynastic duty. There were public appearances where Fatma stood silent beside her husband during ceremonies. To the empire, the union appeared stable and successful. Behind closed doors existed something else entirely. Letters from the period, recently translated from Ottoman Turkish, reveal that the Pasha himself sought escape through military campaigns and opium, attempting to silence what one note describes as the ghost that looks at me with her eyes. He had played his role in a system that destroyed the woman he married, and something in him recognized the horror of it, even if he lacked the vocabulary or courage to name it. Fatma Sultan lived 29 more years after that March night. She became a fixture at imperial ceremonies, an obligated mother, a wife without a voice. Her books remained closed. Her astronomical charts gathered dust. The gardens she once wandered with wonder stood untouched. She existed in a state that was neither fully alive nor mercifully dead, a warning in human form of what the empire did to daughters who dared to be brilliant. Her death came in 1652, officially attributed to brain fever. It occurred on March 15th, the anniversary of her wedding. For many in the palace, this was no coincidence. To them, it felt as though memory itself had finally become unbearable, as though the weight of what she had endured had been slowly crushing her for 29 years until there was nothing left to sustain breath. And Fatma's fate was not unique. Recently opened archives reveal that dozens of Ottoman princesses experienced similar trajectories. Some developed permanent mutism. Others attempted escape through suicide, or what palace records delicately termed madness. A few vanished from official documentation entirely, as if they had never existed. The imperial machine, so meticulous in its ceremonies, proved equally skilled at erasing inconvenient lives. Yet even in this darkness, resistance flickered. Coded letters between princesses, written in a cipher historians only recently decrypted, reveal networks of support and shared survival strategies. Some princesses faked illnesses to delay marriages. Others created elaborate ruses to secure divorces, defying a system that seemed unbreakable. A rare few petitioned the Sultan directly, risking everything to reclaim fragments of agency. These acts of courage, buried for centuries in forbidden archives, tell us something crucial. Even in total subjugation, the human spirit searches for cracks in the walls. What happened to Fatma Sultan exposes an uncomfortable truth about power, that it often consumes those closest to its center first. While the world imagined Ottoman princesses drowning in luxury and privilege, the reality was a different kind of drowning, in expectations. In rituals designed to erase selfhood, in a system that valued their bodies as diplomatic currency but had no use for their minds or hearts. The empire that built architectural wonders and produced poetry, still studied today, also created chambers where daughters were systematically broken. The same hands that drafted laws protecting subjects' rights also drafted protocols for destroying imperial women. These contradictions don't cancel each other out. They coexist, forcing us to hold complexity without the comfort of simple judgment. Centuries later, in a museum archive in Istanbul, a researcher discovered Fatma's childhood astronomy notebook. The margins were filled with questions written in her careful hand. Why do some stars disappear? Where does light go when it dies? Can something vanish and still exist? The final page contained a single sentence, added years later in shakier handwriting. I have become the answer to my own questions. No one knows who added that line or when. But it remains there, preserved behind glass, a whisper from someone who learned too young that brilliance, in the wrong body and the wrong century, could be the most dangerous gift of all.